Welcome to Jesus Leads Bible Journey. In this video, we dive into Deuteronomy chapters 18 to 34, where Moses continues to teach the Israelites about the laws, the importance of leadership, and the promises of God as they prepare to enter the Promised Land. These chapters reflect the heart of God's covenant, His desire for His people to remain holy, to trust in His provision, and to live justly among the nations. From instructions about the Levites and prophets to the warnings against idolatry, Moses prepares Israel for the transition into the land of promise. But most importantly, he reminds them of the faithfulness of God in fulfilling His promises and the importance of choosing life through obedience. Join us as we continue our journey through this powerful book, learning to live in faith, obedience, and holiness, just as God commanded His people so long ago. Chapter 18, the priests and the prophets. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, reminding them of the responsibilities they had before God as they were preparing to enter the Promised Land. He first addressed the Levitical priests, telling the people that they were set apart to serve God. The Levitical priests, indeed the whole tribe of Levi, are to have no allotment or inheritance with Israel. They shall live on the offerings made to the Lord by fire, for that is their inheritance. The priests were to dedicate their lives to serving God and His people, and in return, the people were to provide for their needs. Moses told the people that whenever they offered sacrifices to God, the priests would be entitled to share in the offerings, because they had no land of their own to inherit. Then Moses turned his attention to the issue of prophets. He told the people that God would raise up a prophet like Moses from among them, and they were to listen to him. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. Moses explained that this prophet would speak the words of the Lord, and the people were to follow him. The words of the prophet would be God's words, and they were not to be ignored or rejected. Moses also warned the people about false prophets, those who would arise to lead them astray. If a prophet came and spoke in the name of another god, or encouraged the people to worship idols, that prophet was to be put to death. That prophet or dreamer must be put to death because they preached rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. Moses explained that God would allow these tests to come upon them to see whether they would truly love the Lord with all their hearts and souls. The people were to follow only God's word and listen to His true prophets. Moses reminded them that a prophet's words would never be proven false because God's words are true and faithful. The people were not to fear a true prophet because he spoke in the name of the Lord. God provides true prophets to guide His people. We are called to listen to His voice through His word and the prophets He raises up while rejecting false teachings and idols. Chapter 19. Cities of refuge. Moses continued to speak to the Israelites, giving them more instructions about living justly in the land they were about to enter. He spoke about the cities of refuge, which were to be set up in the land. These cities were designated places where someone who had killed another person accidentally could flee for safety, so they wouldn't be killed by the avenger of blood, a relative of the deceased person seeking revenge. Moses explained that if someone killed another person unintentionally, they could flee to one of these cities of refuge for protection. The people would then be given a fair trial, and if the killing was deemed to be accidental, the person would be allowed to remain in the city. Moses gave specific instructions about how to handle the case of a murderer. If someone killed another person with malice, they were not to be allowed to escape to the city of refuge. They were to be put to death as a way to preserve justice and protect the innocent. The cities of refuge were to be placed strategically throughout the land so that anyone who needed protection could easily reach one. Moses reminded the people that these cities were for the accidental killer only, not for the intentional murderer. Moses also instructed the Israelites to establish a system of justice. If someone committed a crime and was accused of wronging another person, there had to be 2 or 3 witnesses to testify before a sentence could be passed. A single witness was not enough to convict someone. Moses made it clear that they were not to show partiality or favoritism in judgment. Justice must be fair and righteous for all, whether rich or poor, whether an Israelite or a foreigner. Moses warned them that if someone falsely accused another, they would receive the same punishment the accused would have received. This would serve as a deterrent to prevent false accusations and ensure fairness in the community. Finally, Moses reminded the people of the importance of justice in their communities. He said, "Do not show pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Justice must be balanced, and the punishment must fit the crime." God is a God of justice. We are called to live justly, to provide protection for the innocent, and to ensure that justice is always fair, impartial, and righteous. Chapter 20. Laws of Warfare. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, giving them instructions on how to conduct themselves during war. He told them that when they went to battle against their enemies, they were not to be afraid or discouraged. When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid of them, because the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, will be with you. Moses reminded the people that it was the Lord who gave them victory in battle, and they were to trust in his power and protection. Before going into battle, the officers were to address the people, telling them that anyone who had built a house and not yet dedicated it, or planted a vineyard and not yet enjoyed its fruit, or who was engaged to a woman but had not yet married her, could go home. This would allow those who were not fully ready or invested in the fight to return home and avoid unnecessary loss. The officers would also say that anyone who was afraid or faint-hearted could go home, so that fear would not spread among the rest of the army. Moses instructed them that if anyone was left behind due to fear or unfinished business, they should not be ashamed, for the Lord was with those who fought. Once they had organized their forces, they were to approach the city they were going to attack. If the city offered peace and was willing to make a treaty, then they were to accept the offer and live in peace with them. The people of the city would become their servants and live under Israel's rule. However, if the city did not offer peace and chose to fight, they were to besiege it. Once the Lord gave them victory, they were to kill all the men, but the women, children, and livestock could be spared. These would be taken as captives, and their wealth would be given to the Israelites. Moses also spoke about how to handle cities in the distance, those that were far from Israel's borders. The people were to offer peace to those cities first. If they rejected peace and chose to fight, the Israelites were to completely destroy the city, leaving no one alive. But when attacking the cities of the Canaanites, they were to be utterly destroyed, for the Canaanites' sin had reached its fullness. God commanded Israel to not make any covenants or give any mercy to the people living in the land. Finally, Moses gave instructions about the treatment of trees during a siege. He said that they should not destroy trees that bear fruit, because they could provide food for the people. They were only to destroy trees that could not be used for food, such as those that could be used to build siege works. In times of conflict, we are called to trust in the Lord's guidance and protection. God fights on our behalf, and we must be wise and just in our actions. Obedience to God leads to victory, while disobedience leads to destruction. Chapter 21. Laws concerning justice and purification. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, giving them laws to ensure justice, fairness, and purification in their community. He began by addressing a situation where a murder victim was found in the open fields and the killer was unknown. Moses explained that the elders and judges of the city nearest to the body were to take a heifer that had never been yoked or used for labor and bring it to a valley with running water. There they would break its neck, and the priests were to make an offering for the unsolved murder. The elders would then declare that they were innocent of the bloodshed, and the land would be purified. Moses reminded the people that justice must be taken seriously, even in cases where the perpetrator could not be identified. The community was to take responsibility for the land's purity, and this ritual would serve to bring healing and justice. Next, Moses spoke about marriage and inheritance. He gave instructions for a man who had two wives, one loved and the other unloved. If the man had children by both wives, the firstborn son would inherit the double portion of the inheritance, even if he was the child of the unloved wife. This was to prevent favoritism and ensure that the inheritance was passed down fairly. Moses also addressed the issue of the rebellious son, a child who would not listen to his parents and was a constant source of trouble. If a son was stubborn and rebellious, refusing to obey his parents, and they had tried to correct him without success, he could be brought before the elders of the city. If the elders judged that the son was deserving of punishment, he was to be stoned to death by the men of the city. This extreme measure was meant to remove evil from among the people and maintain the purity of the community. Moses then spoke about the treatment of criminals. He instructed the people on how to handle the execution of criminals. If a man was executed and hung on a tree, his body was not to remain on the tree overnight. It was to be buried the same day, so that the land would not be defiled by such a public display of punishment. Moses reminded the Israelites that they were a holy people, and that their actions, laws, and treatment of others must reflect their devotion to God. By following these laws, they would honor God and maintain justice in their community. God's justice requires purity and fairness, even in difficult situations. We are called to uphold justice in our communities, to care for the vulnerable, and to ensure that all actions align with God's holiness. Chapter 22. Laws about relationships and justice. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, giving them laws about relationships, justice, and fairness. He began by addressing the responsibility of returning lost property. If you see your brother's ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it. You must take it back to its owner. If someone found their neighbor's lost property, they were to return it without delay. Moses instructed the people to always look out for each other and act with integrity. This applied to both animals and goods. Next, Moses spoke about the duties of a neighbor. If a neighbor's animal was stuck in a pit, the person who found it should help get the animal out. Moses emphasized that people should never turn a blind eye to the needs of others. They should always help and show compassion to those in need. Moses then gave laws regarding clothing. He commanded that a man should not wear women's clothing, and a woman should not wear men's clothing. This was to maintain the distinction between the sexes and reflect God's order in creation. Moses also addressed a misleading accusation. If a man accused his wife of not being a virgin before marriage, the matter was to be investigated by the elders of the city. If the accusation was found to be false, the man was to be fined, and he could never divorce his wife. However, if the accusation was true, the woman would be punished. Moses gave laws regarding adultery. If a man and a woman were caught in adultery, both the man and the woman were to be stoned to death. This was meant to protect the sanctity of marriage and prevent the spread of immorality in Israel. Moses spoke about cases of rape. If a man raped a woman who was not engaged, he was to pay the bride price and marry her. However, if the woman was engaged to another man, the punishment for the man was death, and the woman was innocent. The law made clear that sexual purity and the protection of relationships were serious matters. Moses then discussed cases involving virginity and engagement. If a man took a woman who was engaged and had sexual relations with her, both were to be put to death. However, if the woman was not engaged, the man would pay a fine to her father and marry her. Finally, Moses gave laws regarding incest and bestiality. He stated that anyone who had sexual relations with a close relative or with an animal was to be put to death. These laws were meant to preserve purity and holiness in the community. God's law teaches us how to live in harmony with one another, with respect, justice, and integrity. We are called to act justly, help those in need, and uphold the sanctity of relationships. Chapter 23. Purity and justice in the community. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, reminding them of the importance of purity and justice in their community. He began by addressing those who were excluded from the assembly of the Lord. Moses stated that eunuchs, those who had been castrated, were not allowed to enter the assembly of the Lord. Likewise, those with physical defects, such as being lame or blind, were also not allowed to participate in the congregation. This was part of God's call for His people to be holy and set apart. Moses also instructed the Israelites to maintain purity in their camp. He said, "For the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you and to deliver your enemies to you. Your camp must be holy so that he will not see among you anything indecent and turn away from you." This meant that the people were to keep their camp free from immorality and uncleanness, because the Lord was with them and desired them to be pure. Next, Moses gave laws about taking care of the poor. He commanded that any money owed to a fellow Israelite should be paid back promptly. If someone borrowed money, they were to pay it back in full, without delay. Moses emphasized that lending money was an act of mercy and should be done with a generous spirit. Moses then addressed the matter of vows and oaths. If a person made a vow to the Lord, they were to fulfill it without delay. They were not to break their promises or fail to complete what they had pledged. But if someone made a vow to another person, they were to honor their word and keep their commitment. Moses reminded the Israelites about treatment of foreigners. He instructed them to be kind to foreigners, especially to those who were poor and in need. They were to give them food and drink and treat them with kindness and respect. Moses then gave laws about sexual conduct. He warned the people not to engage in prostitution or adultery, both of which were considered abominable in God's sight. The people were to avoid such acts and keep their relationships pure and holy. Moses also gave guidance about divorce. He instructed that a man who had divorced his wife should not take her back after she had married another man. This was seen as a violation of the sanctity of marriage and was not to be allowed. Finally, Moses addressed the matter of interest on loans. He told the people that they were not to charge interest when lending money to their fellow Israelites. However, they could charge interest when lending to foreigners. This law was intended to prevent the Israelites from exploiting their fellow countrymen. God's laws are meant to promote purity, justice, and generosity in the community. We are called to live with integrity, to honor our commitments, and to show kindness and mercy to those in need. Chapter 24. Laws concerning marriage, divorce, and justice. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, giving them additional laws regarding marriage, divorce, and justice. He began by addressing the matter of divorce. Moses explained that if a man took a wife and found something indecent about her, he could write her a certificate of divorce and send her away. However, Moses warned that if the woman then married another man and her second husband divorced her, the first husband could not marry her again, for that would be an abomination before the Lord. This law was intended to maintain the sanctity and dignity of marriage. Moses also gave laws concerning a newlywed man. He stated that if a man had recently married, he should not go to war or be burdened with other duties for 1 year. Instead, he was to stay at home and bring happiness to his wife so that they could enjoy their first year of marriage together. Moses then addressed the issue of kidnapping. If someone was caught kidnapping a fellow Israelite and selling them, the kidnapper was to be put to death. This law was meant to protect the people from exploitation and injustice. Moses also gave laws about leprosy. If a person developed a skin disease, they were to be examined by the priest. If the disease was determined to be leprosy, the person was to be declared unclean and isolated from the community. The priest would give further instructions on how to handle the situation. Moses reminded the people of the importance of justice and fairness. He instructed them to not deprive the poor of their rights or take advantage of them. If someone owed a debt, they should not take their neighbor's cloak as collateral, but they should return it to them before sunset, because the cloak was the person's only covering. Moses also addressed the issue of hiring workers. He told the people that they were to pay their workers promptly. They were not to withhold wages, especially from the poor and the needy. Workers should be paid fairly for their labor. Moses also gave a law about punishments for offenses. If a man sinned, the punishment was to be proportionate to the offense. A person should not be punished for the sins of another, and a person should not be put to death for someone else's crime. Finally, Moses instructed the people to always remember that they were once slaves in Egypt, and therefore they were to show kindness to the poor, the widow, and the orphan. He reminded them to leave the gleanings in their fields for the poor and the foreigner. This law was to ensure that no one in Israel went hungry and that the needy were cared for by the community. God's law promotes justice, mercy, and fairness in relationships. We are called to honor marriage, to treat others with respect, and to ensure that the poor and vulnerable are always protected. Chapter 25. Justice, fairness, and compassion. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, giving them further instructions on how to live with justice, fairness, and compassion. He began by addressing punishments for crimes. Moses stated that when two men had a dispute and went to court, the judge was to decide the case fairly. If the guilty man was to be punished, the judge was to give him a 40-lash punishment, but not more than that, for they were to avoid beating him beyond what was just. Moses reminded the people that justice must be fair, and punishments should not be excessive or cruel. The principle of proportionality was to be followed, and no one was to be unjustly treated in the community. Next, Moses addressed the law of levirate marriage. He explained that if a man died without leaving a son, his brother was to marry the widow and raise up a child in his brother's name. This child would be considered the heir to the deceased man's inheritance, so that the family line would not be cut off. Moses instructed that if the brother refused to marry the widow, she was to go before the elders and ask them to intervene. If the brother still refused to fulfill his duty, he was to be publicly shamed, and the widow would be allowed to marry someone else. Moses then gave a law about dishonest weights and measures. He reminded the people that they were to use honest weights in their trade and never cheat one another in business dealings. Do not have two differing weights in your bag, one heavy, one light. Do not have two differing measures in your house, one large, one small. God called his people to integrity in all their dealings, both in their businesses and in their relationships with others. Moses also addressed the issue of compassion for the weak and vulnerable. He reminded the Israelites of the importance of helping those in need, especially the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. They were to be treated with kindness, and Israel was called to take special care of the poor and marginalized in society. Finally, Moses gave laws about fairness in war. He instructed the Israelites that if they went to war and captured a city, they were to make an offer of peace first. If the city accepted, they were to live in peace with the inhabitants. But if the city chose to fight, then they were to besiege it and defeat it. When taking spoils of war, they were not to destroy the fruit-bearing trees, as those would provide food for future generations. God calls his people to live with justice, fairness, and compassion. We are to be merciful in our relationships, upholding integrity in all things, and taking care of the vulnerable in our communities. Chapter 26. The offerings of first fruits and tithes. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, giving them instructions on how to honor God through their offerings and tithes as they prepared to enter the Promised Land. He began by explaining the law regarding the first fruits of the land. When they entered the land and began to harvest their crops, they were to take the first fruits, the first of the grain, the wine, and the oil, and bring them to the Lord. This offering was to be presented at the place God had chosen for his name to dwell. Moses instructed that when bringing the first fruits, the people were to make a declaration before the Lord. They were to acknowledge that God had brought them out of Egypt, a land of slavery, and had given them the Promised Land. They were to remember his faithfulness and grace in providing for them. They were to place the basket of first fruits before the Lord, and the priest would take it and set it before the altar of God. This act of offering the first fruits was not just about giving, it was a declaration of gratitude and recognition of God's provision. By giving the first and best of what they had, the Israelites acknowledged that everything they had was a gift from God, and they showed their trust in him for the future harvest. Next, Moses spoke about the tithe. Every third year, the Israelites were to set aside a special tithe for the poor, the Levites, the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows. This tithe was to be stored in their towns so that those who were in need would have food to eat. The Israelites were to bring this tithe to the designated place and rejoice before the Lord. Moses explained that when the people brought their tithe, they were to make a public declaration. They were to say, "I have removed from my house the sacred portion and have given it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all your commands." By doing this, they would acknowledge that their giving was in obedience to God's commands, and they would ask God to look upon their offerings with favor. Moses reminded the people that God had chosen them as his special people, and they were to be a people set apart for his purposes. They were to keep his commands, to love him with all their heart, soul, and strength, and to walk in his ways. Moses concluded by encouraging the people to follow through on these commitments. If they obeyed God's commands, they would experience his blessings in the land, and God would be faithful to them as he had promised their ancestors. God calls his people to give with a heart of gratitude and obedience. Our offerings reflect our relationship with him and our commitment to honor him with the best of what we have. We are also called to care for those in need, showing generosity and compassion. Chapter 27, the covenant, renewed and the curses pronounced. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites. And in this chapter, he gave them instructions to renew their covenant with God as they entered the promised land. He instructed the people to build an altar to the Lord on Mount Ebal, using stones that had not been shaped by human hands. They were to offer burnt offerings and fellowship offerings on this altar, and to write the words of the law on the stones. Moses told the people that when they crossed the Jordan River into the land, they were to set up large stones and cover them with plaster. On these stones, they were to inscribe all the words of the law so that they would have a visible reminder of God's commandments. Then Moses called for the elders and the priests to come forward, and he gave specific instructions to the tribes of Israel. 6 tribes were to stand on Mount Gerizim to pronounce blessings over the people, while the other 6 tribes were to stand on Mount Ebal to pronounce curses. Moses told the people that they were to listen to these words of blessing and curse and choose life by obeying God's commands. He explained that those who obeyed God would be blessed in every aspect of their lives, but those who turned away from God and disobeyed his law would face curses and destruction. The curses were pronounced for various offenses. Moses said that anyone who broke God's laws would be cursed, including those who made idols or worshipped false gods, dishonored their father or mother, took advantage of the vulnerable, such as orphans, widows, or foreigners, murdered, committed adultery, or kidnapped, dishonestly deceived others. For each of these sins, a curse would be declared, and the people would say, "Amen," affirming the truth of God's word. Moses reminded the people that their obedience to God was key to their prosperity, and that if they obeyed his law, they would experience his blessings in the land they were about to enter. He concluded by calling the people to choose life through obedience to God's commands. The choice between blessings and curses, life and death, was before them. God had set before them the path of righteousness, a path of faithfulness and obedience, which would lead to blessings and the fullness of God's promises. We are called to choose life by following God's law. Obedience to his commands leads to blessings, while disobedience leads to destruction. We must renew our covenant with God and walk in his ways. Chapter 28, Blessings for Obedience and Curses for Disobedience. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, laying before them the blessings and curses that would come upon them based on their obedience or disobedience to God. He began by explaining the blessings that would come if the people faithfully obeyed God's commands. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. Moses told the people that they would be blessed in every area of life. Their fields, flocks, crops, and livestock would prosper. Their families would be blessed and their children would flourish. God would grant them abundant harvests and protect them from their enemies. They would be the head and not the tail, blessed with prosperity, peace, and success. Moses said that the Lord would open the heavens and pour out rain in season, blessing the land and making it fertile. Their enemies would be defeated before them, and they would lend to many nations but borrow from none. The Lord would establish them as a holy people, set apart for his glory, and they would experience favor and blessings in the land they were about to enter. However, Moses also gave the people a strong warning. If you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. He outlined the curses that would come if they disobeyed God's laws. Instead of prosperity and blessing, the people would face hardship, famine, disease, and defeat. Their fields would not yield crops, and their livestock would suffer. Their children would be taken into captivity, and they would live in constant fear and distress. Moses warned them that the curse of disobedience would affect them in every area of their lives. Their cities would be destroyed, their land would be ravaged by invaders, and they would experience humiliation and oppression. The Lord would scatter them among the nations, and they would become a byword and a symbol of failure. Moses also described the physical and emotional toll of these curses. The people would suffer from diseases that would not heal, and they would be driven to despair. They would long for the peace and prosperity they had once enjoyed, but it would be out of their reach. The cursed would be oppressed and helpless, with no one to deliver them. The curses of disobedience were so severe that Moses told the people, "You will become a thing of horror, a byword, and an object of ridicule among all the nations where the Lord will drive you." Moses continued by describing the details of the curse, touching on all aspects of life, from the individual to the national level. The people would be defeated by their enemies, and their lives would be marked by poverty, disease, and hopelessness. Obedience to God brings abundant blessings, while disobedience brings curses and destruction. We are called to choose life, to walk in God's ways, and to trust his faithfulness. Chapter 29, the covenant renewed and the call to obedience. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites as they stood on the plains of Moab, preparing to enter the promised land. He reminded them of the covenant that God had made with them, a covenant that had been established not only with the current generation, but also with their ancestors. Moses said, "You are standing today in the presence of the Lord your God, your leaders and chief men, your elders and officials, and all the other men of Israel, together with your children and your wives, and the foreigners living in your camps who chop your wood and carry your water." This was a covenant for everyone in the community, from the highest leader to the most humble servant. All were part of this sacred agreement with God. Moses reminded the people of the miracles and wonders they had witnessed during their time in the wilderness. God had protected them and led them through the desert, providing for them every step of the way. Despite all that God had done for them, they had not yet fully understood or received his ways. He told them that God was making this covenant with them again, a covenant to bless them and protect them. But this covenant required their faithfulness and obedience. "I am making this covenant with its oath, not only with you who are standing here today in the presence of the Lord our God, but also with those who are not here today." Moses emphasized that God's covenant was meant to be a binding agreement that would last for generations. The people were called to obey the Lord's commands and walk in his ways so that they might be blessed and remain in the land. Moses warned the people not to be deceived by false security or false hopes. He cautioned them not to think that because they were part of the covenant, they would automatically receive God's blessings if they did not obey him. "Make sure there is no root among you that produces such bitter fruit as to cause trouble and defile many." He warned that if someone turned away from God and followed the idols of the surrounding nations, they would bring destruction upon themselves and the whole community. Moses told the people that if they turned away from God, the Lord will not be willing to forgive them. God would allow them to face the consequences of their disobedience, and they would suffer his judgment. However, Moses also reminded the Israelites of the mercy of God. God would not forget the covenant he had made with their ancestors, and if they repented and returned to him, he would restore them. When you are in distress and all these things have happened to you, then in later days you will return to the Lord your God and obey him. Moses called the people to remember that God's ways were righteous and just. He had given them his laws to guide them and protect them. The things God had commanded them were not too difficult or beyond their reach. They were to choose life by obeying God's commands, and through that, they would receive his blessings and protection. Moses concluded by calling the people to make a conscious decision to obey God. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live. The choice was clear: to obey God and live, or to disobey and face the consequences. God's covenant with his people is an invitation to live in obedience, which leads to blessings and life. We are called to choose life by following God's commands and remaining faithful to him. Chapter 30, the choice of life and death. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, calling them to make a choice that would determine their future. He reminded them of the covenant that God had made with them, a covenant of blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. Moses told them that even though they would face challenges and difficulties, they could still choose to return to God and experience his mercy. Moses began by saying, "When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come upon you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations, and when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul according to everything I command you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you." Moses assured the people that God would never abandon them. Even if they turned away and faced the consequences of their sin, if they repented and returned to God, he would gather them from the nations where he had scattered them and bring them back to the land he had promised their ancestors. He reminded the people that God's commands were not too difficult or beyond their reach. The word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so you may obey it. Moses encouraged them to choose life, to follow the commands of God and to walk in his ways. Moses presented the choice before them. "I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice and hold fast to him." By choosing life, they would prosper and live in the land. But by choosing death, they would face destruction. Moses emphasized that choosing life was the path to blessing. The choice to love God and walk in his ways was the choice that would lead to true life, both in the land and in their relationship with God. Finally, Moses called on the people to recognize that life was in God alone. "For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses urged the Israelites to choose life by following God's commands and remaining faithful to his covenant. This was the only way for them to live in peace and experience the fullness of God's blessings. The choice of life is always before us. By choosing to follow God and obey his commands, we experience his blessings and we live in relationship with him. The path of obedience leads to life, while disobedience leads to destruction. Chapter 31, Moses' final instructions to Israel. Moses continued his speech to the Israelites, knowing that his time was coming to an end. He was now 120 years old, and he would not be able to enter the promised land with the people. Yet before he departed, he had important instructions for the Israelites to follow. Moses called Joshua, his appointed successor, and publicly declared that Joshua would lead the people into the land. "Be strong and courageous," Moses told him, "for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors to give them, and you must divide it among them as their inheritance." Moses reassured Joshua that God would be with him, just as he had been with Moses. Moses then turned to the people, telling them that God would never leave nor forsake them. He encouraged them to be strong and not be afraid, for the Lord was going ahead of them. God would give them victory over the nations they were to drive out, and they would inherit the land promised to their ancestors. Moses also commanded the priests and the elders of Israel to gather the people every 7 years during the Feast of Tabernacles and to read the law aloud to the entire nation. This was to ensure that every generation knew God's commands and could follow them faithfully. The law was not to be forgotten or ignored. Moses then wrote down the law, completing it and giving it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. He instructed them to read the law to the people at the end of every 7 years, so that the Israelites would remember and obey God's words. Moses also gave a prophetic message to the Israelites. He knew that after his death, the people would eventually turn away from God. I know what they are inclined to do even before I bring them into the land I promised them on oath. He knew that the Israelites would rebel, and he called upon them to sing a song that would serve as a testimony for them in the future. This song would remind them of God's faithfulness and the consequences of turning away from him. The Lord then spoke to Moses, telling him to commission Joshua as the new leader. Moses and Joshua were to go to the tent of meeting, where God would give Joshua the strength and courage to lead the people. God is always with his people, guiding and providing for them. We are called to follow his commands, to choose leaders who trust in his ways, and to remember his faithfulness through the generations. Chapter 32, the Song of Moses. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, and in this chapter, he delivered a song, a final message from God to his people. This song would serve as a testimony against Israel, a reminder of God's faithfulness and the consequences of disobedience. Moses called for the heavens and the earth to listen to the words of the song, for they would bear witness to the covenant between God and his people. Listen, you heavens, and I will speak. Hear, you earth, the words of my mouth. Moses began the song by declaring the greatness and justice of God, saying that his ways are perfect, faithful, and righteous. He is the rock, his works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. Moses reminded the people that God had been faithful to Israel, but they had been unfaithful to him. He painted a picture of how God had chosen Israel, nurtured them, and made them a great nation. But instead of gratitude, Israel had turned to idolatry and disobedience. Is this the way you repay the Lord, you foolish and unwise people? Is he not your father, your creator, who made you and formed you? Moses then recounted the history of Israel, how God had led them through the wilderness, provided for them, and given them a land flowing with milk and honey. But in times of prosperity, they had forgotten God, turning to idols and following the ways of the surrounding nations. Moses foretold the consequences of Israel's disobedience. Because they had broken the covenant with God, they would face the judgment of the Lord. I will hide my face from them, God said, and see what their end will be. Despite Israel's future unfaithfulness, Moses reassured them that God would never completely abandon them. Even in their rebellion, God would show mercy and eventually bring them back. Moses continued the song, declaring that the enemies of Israel would also face judgment. God would use Israel's enemies to bring about judgment, but in the end, he would vindicate his people. For the Lord will vindicate his people and relent concerning his servants. Moses concluded the song by urging the Israelites to remember all that God had done for them. He called on them to teach their children the song so that it would remain a testimony for generations to come. This song would remind them of the blessings of obedience and the curses of disobedience. God is faithful, just and merciful. We are called to remember his goodness and to walk in his ways, for he has delivered us from sin and calls us to obedience. But if we turn away from him, we will face the consequences of our actions. Chapter 33, Moses' final blessing to the tribes of Israel. Moses continued speaking to the Israelites, giving them his final blessings before his death. He called upon the Lord, the one true God, to come and bless his people, Israel. Moses' words were filled with love, guidance, and prophecy for each of the tribes. Moses began by blessing the tribe of Reuben. He prayed that Reuben would live and not die, and that his people would be counted among the blessed. Moses called for Reuben's numbers to increase and for his descendants to be strong. Then Moses turned to Judah, praying that the Lord would hear Judah's cry for help. Hear, Lord, the cry of Judah, and bring him to his people. Moses prayed that Judah would be victorious over his enemies, and that his people would be secure in the land. Moses also blessed the tribe of Levi, the tribe of priests, who were responsible for serving the Lord and teaching his law. He asked God to bless the Levites with wisdom, understanding, and the ability to guide Israel in holiness. He prayed that they would instruct the people in God's ways and that they would be faithful to their calling. Bless all his skills, Lord, and be pleased with the work of his hands. Next, Moses blessed the tribe of Benjamin, praying that they would dwell securely with the Lord's protection. He asked that God would shelter them all the days of their lives, and that Benjamin would be protected by the Lord's strength. Moses then turned to Joseph, praising him for the blessings of God that had been upon his life. He prayed that Joseph's descendants would be blessed with abundance, with the finest of the land and the richness of the earth. Joseph was to be like a bull in strength, a mighty warrior blessed by the Lord. Next, Moses turned to the tribe of Zebulun. He prayed that Zebulun would rejoice in their journeys and that they would spread God's glory across the seas. Moses also prayed for the tribe of Issachar, asking God to bless them with prosperity and success in their labor. Moses then blessed Gad, praying that they would live in peace and that they would be protected from their enemies. He asked God to bless Gad's territory and give them the courage to defend it. Moses also gave a blessing to Dan, praying that they would be strong and courageous, like a lion cub that would leap forward and defend the people. He blessed Naphtali with abundance, praying that they would be filled with favor and blessings from the Lord. Naphtali was to be a people who enjoyed the good things of the land, rich in the Lord's provision. Lastly, Moses gave a special blessing to the tribe of Asher, praying that they would be blessed with the best of the land and abundance. He prayed for their prosperity, asking God to bless their food and water so that they would be a people of strength and vitality. Moses then concluded his blessings by praising God for his greatness. He declared that there was no one like God who rides across the heavens to help his people. God is the eternal God, the refuge, and he will always be with his people, giving them the strength and courage to stand firm. Moses reminded the people that God had been their protector and provider, and that they would continue to be blessed as long as they remained faithful to him. God blesses his people abundantly when they live in obedience to him. Each tribe received a unique blessing, and each blessing was a reflection of God's faithfulness and love for his people. We too are called to trust in God's blessings, to live in his will, and to be a light to the world. Chapter 34. The death of Moses. Moses went up to the plains of Moab to the top of Mount Nebo, from where the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev and the whole region, from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, as the Lord had said. He was buried in the land of Moab near Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. As we come to the end of Deuteronomy, we witness the death of Moses, the man who led Israel out of Egypt, guided them through the wilderness, and received God's law for his people. Moses' death marks the close of one era and the beginning of another. Joshua, his faithful assistant, takes up the mantle of leadership. The book of Deuteronomy is a powerful reminder of God's faithfulness to his people, his commandments for holy living, and the blessings of obedience to his word. Through Moses' final speech and the blessings given to each tribe, we see that God's plan for Israel is filled with mercy, guidance, and hope. Though Moses could not enter the promised land, he had led Israel faithfully and prepared them for the journey ahead. God's promises remained intact, and Joshua would lead them into the land of promise. Moses' death is not a tragic end, but the fulfillment of God's plan for his people to inherit the land. As we reflect on Moses' life, we are reminded to choose life by following God's commands, trusting in his guidance, and walking in obedience to his word. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey through Deuteronomy. We have seen God's covenant with Israel unfold, from his commandments to the blessings and curses of obedience. Through Moses' leadership, Israel was reminded of God's faithfulness and his call to walk in his ways. As we move forward, may we be inspired to live lives of obedience and faithfulness to God, knowing that his promises are true and his love endures forever. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to stay updated with more of our Bible journeys. Continue with us as we explore the depth and richness of God's Word, chapter by chapter, book by book.